People love Canon cameras for their strong image quality and user-friendly design, but you don't have to break the bank to get one. On this list, I've got budget options for you whether you're a casual shooter or a professional looking to get started. Also, you'll see links in the description down below for the best pricing and the most current pricing on all the products that we talk about today. So the first camera on this list is the Canon T7. The Canon T7 is one of the most affordable cameras not only on this list, but also the camera industry in general. You can probably find something slightly cheaper, but it also comes at a loss in image quality. So what makes the Canon T7 such a great camera besides the price? It has a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor, which is the standard sensor that you see in much more expensive cameras like the Canon M50 or the Canon 80D. And like every Canon camera, it gives you stellar colors right in camera. It's really easy to get stunning photos and videos that just pop without any editing. Although it doesn't have the same image processor as the more expensive cameras, so it only shoots photos at 3 frames per second. This is good enough for anyone who's a casual shooter for parties, travels, concerts, and even some low-key professional work like real estate and corporate videos and headshots. But where you might find an issue is for fast-moving subjects like sports, dance, or pets. But don't worry, if you're looking to shoot something fast-moving, I have 2 cameras for you later in this list that will do exactly that. And in photo mode, if you use the optical viewfinder for autofocus, the autofocus is fast enough to keep up with fast-moving subjects. It's very fast and extremely reliable. But video is where this camera kind of drops the ball. The video quality itself is super solid. It records full HD at 24 and 30 frames per second, but it doesn't have an input for external audio, but the internal audio is still pretty solid as long as you're only about 3 to 4 feet away from the camera. The place where this camera does have issues is autofocus in video mode, especially when you use the rear LCD. When it comes to video mode autofocus, it's pretty unreliable and kind of hit and miss. The one solution I have been able to figure out is to use something known as quick mode, where it quickly flips between the optical viewfinder and the LCD to get focus from the optical viewfinder and then back to the LCD. It's not perfect, but it's something. If you're doing a sit-down talking head thing like I am, where your focus doesn't really need to change, or you're pretty good with manual focus, this camera is a great value for video. The autofocus is just not ideal. But don't worry, there are 2 other cameras on this list that deliver reliable and fast autofocus in video mode. I got you. But then why exactly should you pick up the Canon T7? Simply put, the body and design. A lot of people love that old school DSLR style body. It's robust, super solid, it's built like a tank despite being a budget model. This thing can take a beating. The button layout is super simple along with the menu system. Canon has this lovely minimal design philosophy that makes their cameras really easy to use. Even if you're new to cameras, you can easily pick this thing up and get great results. I always tell people that Canon is probably the most beginner-friendly brand out there. The only downside of this camera is that the screen on the back is fixed, which makes it tough to get high-angle or low-angle shots. But if you want to get stunning image quality for both photos and videos, and you want a beginner camera that's easy to pick up and get great results with, my first recommendation to you would definitely be the Canon T7. But if the Canon T7 is a little too much of a chunky boy for you and you want great photos and videos with better autofocus, I have a camera for you that literally fits in your pocket, and that is the Canon G7X Mark III. The G7X Mark III is probably one of the best compact cameras you'll ever use. It's also a really popular camera with not only casual users, but also vloggers and YouTubers. The G7X is extremely small and durable, and it lives up to the stellar Canon design philosophy. It has a flip-up screen so you can see yourself, but that screen also has touch autofocus and touch controls, which makes operating this camera very user-friendly and about as complicated as using a smartphone on Pro mode. And it has a 20 megapixel 1-inch sensor with phenomenal Canon colors that require almost no editing. However, what really sets this camera apart from other point-and-shoots, besides the price, is the built-in lens with a very fast aperture. It has a variable aperture between f1.8 to f2.8 and a focal length between 24 to 100 millimeters, which basically makes this a very good camera for low light, and the fast aperture naturally gives you that cinematic blurry background look, aka the bokeh. And the lens allows for a ton of flexibility where you can get wide shots, close-up shots, and even macro shots, which are super close-ups. And when it comes to photos, holy cow, this thing is fast. It shoots 20 frames per second, which is about as fast as a $5,000 professional sports camera like the 1DX. Although the professional cameras have a bigger sensor, interchangeable lenses, a whole lot more going for them, but it's really cool to see a small compact camera shoot at this incredible speed. And because the G7X shoots in RAW, you can do a lot with these photos when it comes to editing. But what about video? When it comes to video, it shoots in full HD and 4K at 24 and 30 frames per second, and it also has slow motion at 60 frames per second for 2x slow motion and 120 frames per second for buttery smooth 5x slow motion. This is honestly one of my favorite video cameras out there because it gives you so much horsepower in this tiny little package. On top of that, the G7X Mark III also has an input for external audio, which is really nice to see on a small compact camera like this. But in case you don't want to add a mic to this camera, the internal audio itself is super solid. And it's the same as the previous version of this camera, the G7X Mark II, that was only internal audio, and it was probably one of the top 3 cameras for YouTubers and vloggers this past 5 years. And speaking of the older G7X Mark II, it's a cheaper and older version of the G7X Mark III. The only major features that are missing is 4K and slower frame rates besides the input for external audio. It's definitely cheaper and it's still a great camera, so check it out in the description down below, or feel free to pick this camera up used. It's still a great camera 5 years later. But overall, the G7X Mark III is a great beginner YouTuber, beginner vlogging camera, or just a casual everyday life camera. It's compact and it gives you pretty much everything you need to get started right away and start taking great photos and videos. The only thing the G7X series is really lacking is a larger sensor for more cinematic and more professional looking photos and videos. Plus, it doesn't have a mount for interchangeable lenses. But if that is something you want, the next camera and the last camera on this list is probably what you're looking for, and that is the Canon M50. The M50 has pretty much everything you love about Canon cameras, but with the horsepower and features of a high-end professional camera. It pretty much gives you everything the T7 and the G7X were missing. But one thing to note, there's actually 2 versions of the M50. There's the M50 Mark I and the M50 Mark II. But the truth is, the M50 Mark II isn't that different of a camera. It's only improved a couple of small things, and you could really think of it as the M50 Plus. And don't worry, I'll explain what those differences are later in this section where it makes more sense. For starters, the M50 Mark II has a side articulating screen that has touch autofocus and touch controls, but the great thing about having a side articulating screen is that you can use it to not only film yourself, but it's also easier to get high angles and low angles with this camera. And the touch autofocus on the Canon M50 is something truly special. It is one of the best autofocusing systems you will ever use. The M50 has that excellent Canon minimal button, minimal menu design that makes this camera super easy to use, and even if you're a beginner, you can get great results with it. Plus, it has an input for external audio along with really solid internal audio. But let's talk about the specs and technology in this camera so you can see what it actually does for you. It has the same 24 megapixel sensor that you find in the Canon T7, but what sets the M50 apart is that it has a better image processor that allows it to shoot faster frame rates, have better autofocus, and it's also better in low light conditions. As for photos, it shoots 10 frames per second, which is slower than the G7X Mark III, but it is also a bigger sensor with more data coming through, so it's natural that it's a bit slower. But 10 frames per second is really fast enough to shoot any kind of subject matter, even if it's fast moving. And the M50 also shoots photos in 14-bit RAW, which means you get tons of flexibility when it comes to editing your photos. You can easily create professional level work with this camera if you want to, and if you're just a casual user, you're simply going to be impressed by how good this camera looks with barely any editing. The M50 Mark I has intelligent face and object tracking, but the M50 Mark II has 30% faster autofocus, and it also includes intelligent eye tracking, which is simply more accurate when it comes to shooting people. And the M50 Mark II also has a feature for wireless live streaming to any platform of your choice. If you are a live streamer, this is going to make your life a whole lot easier without having to bother with capture cards, connecting it to your PC, or just simple things like wires. And both the Mark I and Mark II are great choices for someone that's video focused because it has a lot of great video features. It does full HD in 24 and 30 frames per second, which looks beautiful. And it also has a slow motion mode for full HD at 60 frames per second for 2x slow motion. It does have 120 frames per second for 5x slow motion, but it does that at a lower resolution at 720p, which is half the resolution of full HD. Now the M50 does have 4K, but in 4K mode, it's pretty much pushing this camera to its very limit. So when you go into 4K mode, it actually crops into your sensor, basically zooms in your image, which makes it hard to get wide shots, but it also isn't the highest 4K quality. And if you're looking to get a 4K camera, this probably isn't your best bet. But the biggest issue is that when you go into 4K mode, the spectacular autofocusing system gets really slow and a little bit unreliable. This is true for even the Mark II version. Personally, I don't think the M50 is a great 4K camera, but it's a nice feature to have in case you need that extra resolution for detail shots. Most of the time, I would recommend using this camera in full HD mode because the results you get from this camera in simply HD are stunning. Plus, just like every other Canon camera, it has that fantastic minimalist design philosophy, so you can easily pick this camera up and get great results. So if you want to get better quality videos without having to spend a ton of money on expensive new gear that you really don't need, because here's the secret, it's all about learning how to use your camera properly. Check out the link in the description down below to my 7 simple secrets that show you how to get the most out of the camera that you're using right now, even if that camera is a smartphone. You'll get easy steps on how to really improve your work today. So make sure to check that out. And if you have any questions about the product that we talked about today or the free training, make sure to hit me up in the comments down below and I'll make sure to get back to you. With that being said, guys, I will either see you in the comments, the free training, or in the next video. Peace.